To properly assemble the lock ring joint and realize the maximum speed and ease of assembly, the following instructions should be followed. With clean rags, brushes, or other tools, thoroughly clean the socket, removing mud, gravel, or any other matter that might cause the front of the Fast-Tight gasket to protrude into the path of the spigot. Next, wipe the gasket clean, and after flexing one or more loops, insert the gasket into the gasket recess of the socket, with the large sealing end of the gasket toward the rear of the socket and the harder part in the narrow groove. Press the gasket into the corresponding socket recesses so the gasket is seated completely and uniformly in the socket grooves. Be sure no gasket loops or bulges protrude into the path of the entering spigot. In extremely cold conditions, make sure gaskets are warmed before installing. With a clean brush, apply a liberal amount of Fast-Tight lubricant completely over the exposed inner surface of the gasket after it is placed in the socket. Also apply lubricant completely over the spigot end of the pipe, spigot end taper or radius, and the outer surface of the pipe spigot up to the welded-on retainer ring. Use only lubricant supplied by American. For underwater or very wet conditions, special American lubricant is recommended and available upon request. Do not allow the lubricated spigot end of the pipe to contact the ground prior to joint assembly. Assembly tools are available from American on a deposit basis for installers not choosing assembly with a backhoe or similar equipment. Contact American for details. Once the spigot is completely inserted, as also evidenced by the assembly stripe's disappearance into the bell, fully loosen the outside stud closure nut to the end of the stud, allowing the lock ring to expand into the bell socket locking groove. In lieu of the outside stud closure nut provided for this purpose, some prefer to replace it prior to trench assembly with a quick-release locking clamp or grip device. The correct seating of the lock ring in the socket locking groove should be accompanied by an obvious spreading of the lock ring struts. It is extremely important to confirm proper seating of the lock ring in the socket locking groove completely around the entire circumference of each joint. If inspection around the joint reveals that the lock ring is not completely seated in the socket locking groove at any location, the lock ring may be completely seated by tapping the loose lock ring into the socket locking groove with a flat caulking tool and/or by moving the entering pipe slightly. When a visual inspection to determine the lock ring position isn't practical, such as an underwater installation, a feeler gauge can be used to ensure that the lock ring is correctly seated in the socket locking groove all around the joint. Once the lock ring is correctly seated in the socket locking groove, turn the inside stud spreader nut out firmly against the strut to ensure firm expansion of the lock ring in the socket locking groove. During the lock ring spreading operation, the outside stud closure nut should be positioned so as not to restrict the outward movement of the drilled strut on the stud. The outside stud closure nut performs no function in the finished joint. However, this closure nut can be used for simplifying disassembly of the joint, if required, by reversing the assembly procedure. Once the inside spreader nut is properly positioned, the lock ring is positively secured in the socket locking groove and the joint is ready to perform. Most flexible restrained pipeline joint designs, including the lock ring joint, allow some amount of axial movement after assembly of their locking mechanisms. In some installations, such as exposed piping or with connections of flexible restrained joint piping at angles to rigid piping or other structures, substantial movement may be undesirable. In such cases, it will be necessary to pull or extend the joints after proper assembly has been verified. For details on optimal installation methods and tools, call American's Customer Service Department at 1-800-442-ADIP or contact your American sales engineer for assistance.